As a primarily Gothic author, I thought I would talk today about Gothic fiction, the components of Gothic fiction, some of the subtypes of Gothic fiction, and end with like the prototype of what type of person is most likely to enjoy Gothic fiction. I thought I would also do like a full breakdown of like my favorite Gothic recommendations, but that I think is a video for another day because it would be way too long. But let me know if that's something you might be interested in. Without further ado, let's talk about Gothic fiction. So what are the components of Gothic fiction? What do people mean when they're talking about Gothic books? Oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind is an isolating, encapsulating, often deteriorating, sometimes historic setting, like the castle in Dracula. Like in my own book, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, the Victorian-era hotel and the lighthouse. A haunted mansion, like in The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Even like a tower, like in Rapunzel. Oftentimes these settings serve as a metaphor for the protagonist's isolated, deteriorating psyche, because in Gothic fiction, the setting serves almost like a macrocosm of the protagonist's inner state. It's an externalization of their inner processes. Another frequent component of Gothic fiction is the supernatural. While Gothic fiction typically takes place in our current world, it has supernatural creatures and elements as part of it. Whether it's ghosts, sirens, witches, the fae, vampires, cryptids, or even more esoteric mythological creatures, like vampires in A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, a water spirit like in Daughters of the Lake by Wendy Webb, witches and fae like in The Lighthouse Witches. Gothic fiction often deals with things that are invisible, including mental illness and including the supernatural. So often those supernatural creatures are metaphors or reveal certain themes. Vampires have sometimes been used as commentary on addiction, like in The Vampire Diaries, sexual temptation, like in Dracula, psychopathy, also in The Vampire Diaries, depression, like in Nosferatu. Sirens are often used to regard themes of revenge, violence against women, seduction and manipulation. Ghosts are often used to deal with themes of grief or loss, guilt. The haunted home is kind of like a metaphor for family secrets and trauma. So you see how often these supernatural creatures, it's not just about the supernatural creature, it's about what the supernatural creature is a metaphor for. Mental illness, unreliable narrators, and all things related to that are another component of Gothic fiction. Gothic fiction often makes readers wonder, is something supernatural or strange actually happening here? Or is the protagonist just out of their mind? Like in my upcoming novel, The Splintered Parts, which hopefully will come out sometime next spring. That's very much the question I want readers to wonder. Is it in the protagonist's head? Is it a supernatural creature? Is there a scientific explanation? What is going on? Gothic fiction rose to popularity around the same time as the field of psychology's inception, when people were starting to discover ailments of the mind, so it makes sense that the two kind of go hand in hand. Gothic fiction also often includes experiences outside of typical consciousness. Dreams, nightmares, visions, sleepwalking. For example, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, there is Lucy sleepwalking. In Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, there are visions. This is often a pushback against the rising Enlightenment and rationalism of the 18th and 19th centuries. Also, these experiences outside of typical consciousness were usually associated with the supernatural. For example, women who could induce a trance were seen as witches in certain cultures in certain times. And so these extrasensory experiences go hand in hand with the elements of the supernatural that I was talking about earlier. And also when Gothic fiction rose to popularity, it was a time of cultural anxiety around shifting sexual norms. So you would see a lot of possessed female characters because of that. Fear, dread, and horror are also usually associated with Gothic fiction. I'm sorry, you guys, I really try to pronounce horror correctly, but English is not my native language and there are some words that are just still really hard for me to pronounce. I know what it sounds like. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do what I can. Now, Gothic fiction isn't always Gothic horror, but often the two go together. For example, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca isn't horror, but it is Gothic because it contains a lot of the other elements of Gothic fiction that I'm talking about today. Death is also often a component of Gothic fiction. because nothing is scarier than death, because death is often a gateway to a supernatural state, and because, again, at the time of Gothic fiction coming to life, that was a time of a lot of existential questions for people. Empiricism versus spiritualism were kind of battling it out. People were asking, where do we go when we die? Do we have a soul? Can the dead be brought back? Things like that. Often, Gothic fiction contains a historical setting, but again, not always. Often it is the 18th, 19th century, because again, that's when the Gothic genre mainly rose. For instance, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice takes place in the 18th century. A Long Time Dead by Samara Breger takes place during the Victorian era, the 19th century. Or sometimes, like my own novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, it's dual POV where like one of the storylines take place in a historical setting and the other one is modern day. And this leads me to my next component of Gothic fiction, which is the connection between the past and present, and often the past coming to haunt the present. For example, 19th century books like Dracula included 15th century vampires. Today, modern days, we will have sometimes 18th, 19th century vampires or other supernatural creatures. Like, we are frightened by something that's, I would say, like, at least 200 to 300 years in the past. It just gives us this feeling of like primordial dread, because we feel like when a supernatural creature is that old, it must hold very ancient, secret knowledge. It must be very wise, and therefore it's very frightening. It has, a skill set that's much more than what a modern day mortal has. And this is a very psychoanalytic concept, this idea that if the past is unaddressed, it's going to come back to haunt the present. So, family legacy secrets, past traumas, houses where terrible things happened, like all these things in Gothic fiction, the past eventually comes back to take effect, to exact revenge on the present. And another characteristic of Gothic fiction is often very atmospheric, immersive, flowery prose, because those were more of the standards of writing at the time when Gothic fiction arose around the Victorian era. That has remained the way that the genre typically looks. If you know me, you know that that is absolutely my bread and butter. I love when books are extremely flowery and vivid and transportive. And for some reason, that just fits really well with the Gothic genre. It really immerses you into the atmosphere. So those are, I would say, some of the main components of Gothic fiction. If you are a lover of Gothic fiction and you feel like I forgot any, please do let me know what you think I missed. Let's talk a little bit about the subtypes of Gothic fiction, and this is also not an exclusive list. The classic Gothic, these are books mainly from the 18th, 19th century, such as The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Then you have American Gothics, which take place usually somewhere around the East Coast or like the transatlantic area. Often they take place during the Civil War. Often they take place in Puritan New England, such as Slewfoot by Brom, Hour of the Witch by Chris Bogelian, The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. There's one that takes place in Vermont called The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. Sometimes they also involve indigenous mythology like Dead of November by Craig Brockman, who is an indie author from what I know, and I really, really loved this book. So I always try to mention this whenever I can because I know people like to support indie authors, and this is one that I think is very high quality. But then within American Gothic fiction, there's also the subcategory of Southern Gothic, which is very popular. This one often deals again with the Civil War and also themes of slavery, racism. It just has like a very sticky and oppressively hot atmosphere. Think American Horror Story Coven season. One book at the top of my head is Cicadas Sing of Summer Graves, or Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. For some reason also like really fits well with vampire mythology. Then there are also Scottish Gothic books like The Whistling by Rebecca Netley, A Haunting in the Arctic by C.J. Cook, The Lighthouse Witches by C.J. Cook. There are also English Gothic novels. More recently, there are also Gothic fantasy books coming to life. So One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig is one, A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And also Latin American Gothic fiction is starting to become more popular, such as Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, such as The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. So these are just some of the subtypes of Gothic fiction that you might look into. So who might be a good fit for a Gothic fiction? What is like the type of person who is most likely to love Gothic fiction? I think it's somebody who feels like they maybe belong in a past era or sort of like romanticizes or loves history. Someone who knows what it's like to struggle with mental illness or trauma. Someone who loves escapism, specifically retreating into fantasy worlds and immersing themselves into atmospheric, vivid, transportive fiction. Someone who keeps themselves open to supernatural or spiritual experiences, and someone who's experienced significant loss in their past. I think if this kind of sounds like you, Gothic fiction might be the thing for you. And if you love Gothic fiction, there's a good chance some of this describes you. So let me know if you want that video going into all the Gothic books I've read and kind of breaking down what my recommendations are, both classic and modern. If you have any additional input on the Gothic genre and also any recommendations, because I'm always looking for those. And if you're into Gothic fiction, check out A Song of Dead Man's Cove, my most recent novel, because that could be right up your alley. Take care.